In the year 1475, a new establishment opened its doors in the heart of Istanbul. Its name? Kiva Han. It was the first recorded coffee house in human history. Customers lined up at the door. Some played chess, some fiercely debated poetry, others simply sat in silence and thought. At the time, a single cup of this dark liquid cost half a day's wage for an ordinary labourer. A quiet revolution had just begun in Ottoman Istanbul, but no one had realised it yet. Today, 25,000 cups of coffee are consumed every single second. Over 2 billion cups a year, every day, without fail. Coffee is the second most heavily traded commodity on the planet, trailing only behind oil. But this story does not begin in Istanbul. It begins deep within a misty forest in the Kaffa region of Ethiopia, around the year 850. On this channel, I tell the stories of the commodities that forever altered the course of human history: spices, metals, and beverages. If these kinds of stories fascinate you, please subscribe. You won't want to miss the next one. In the southwestern highlands of Ethiopia, perched thousands of meters above sea level along the Great Rift Valley, lies an ancient, impenetrable forest. This is the region of Kaffa. For most of the year, it is completely swallowed by a heavy grey mist. The air here is perpetually thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, primal odour of untamed wildlife. In these ancient lands, where humanity itself took its very first steps, the relentless evolution of nature was quietly harbouring a profound secret. For millennia, kingdoms were forged, wars were fought, and great civilizations rose and fell. Yet, deep within this foggy wilderness, a single, unassuming tree waited patiently to be discovered. It is no coincidence that Ethiopia, today one of the world's greatest coffee producers, is the motherland of this plant. The soil of Kaffa is a violent volcanic inheritance that gives the coffee bean its very soul. Historians cannot pinpoint the exact year, but it was likely sometime in the mid-9th century. According to legend, a young goat herder named Kaldi led his flock up into the misty foothills just as he did every single morning. The life of a herder is agonizingly monotonous and silent. It begins with the rising of the sun and ends when it sets. But on that particular morning, something was different. As Kaldi waited in the shade of a tree during the blistering midday heat, he noticed that his flock was not resting. On the contrary, the animals were completely restless. They were rearing up on their hind legs, bleating wildly, and leaping through the underbrush with the manic energy of wild mountain goats. Hours passed. The sun began to set. The flock returned to the pen, but the goats still wouldn't sleep. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, their energy seemingly limitless. Kaldi was utterly baffled. What could possibly possess an animal with such terrifying endurance? The next morning, he made a decision. He would follow his flock deep into the heart of the forest. He found the goats gathered around a dense shrub with dark green glossy leaves, and clinging to its branches were small, plump, violently red berries. From a distance, they looked almost exactly like ordinary cherries. Hesitantly, Kaldi reached out. He snapped a branch and popped one of the red fruits into his mouth. It wasn't sweet. The skin was tough and the flesh was incredibly bitter. Hidden beneath the mucilage were two small, flat seeds pressed tightly against each other. They were difficult to chew. But mere minutes later, Kaldi felt something he had never experienced in his entire life. He felt the blood accelerate through his veins. The heavy, exhausting fog that constantly clouded his mind suddenly shattered. His eyes widened. The crushing fatigue in his muscles vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying, electric state of absolute wakefulness. This was humanity's very first encounter with a sensation it would never, ever be able to give up. The moment of awakening. Trembling with excitement, Kaldi gathered a handful of the magical red berries and ran to a nearby Sufi monastery. He presented the fruits to the head monk, frantically describing the bizarre, electric wakefulness surging through his body. But the monk's eyes didn't fill with curiosity. They filled with absolute terror. To him, an energy that so violently defied human nature could only come from one source. "This is the work of the devil," the monk screamed. "This is the fruit of heathens." And with a swift motion, he hurled Kaldi's handful of berries directly into the roaring flames of the courtyard fire. The red skins melted away instantly. The seeds blackened, blistering and cracking in the intense heat. But then, something miraculous happened. A scent began to fill the courtyard, an aroma that no human being had ever smelled before. It was the intoxicating, heavy scent of a roasted coffee bean. Today, no matter where you are in the world, it is the exact same magnificent aroma that fills your kitchen in the morning. The monks were completely paralyzed by the scent. The so-called devil's fruit, rather than being destroyed by the fire, had merely been unlocked. In a frantic panic, they raked the blackened beans from the embers, crushed them, and poured boiling water over the ash. The very first cup of coffee in human history was born from a terrified attempt to destroy it. Historians still debate how much of this legendary tale is fact and how much is fiction. But one thing is absolutely certain. When coffee crossed the Red Sea and arrived in Yemen, it assumed an entirely different, sacred purpose. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Sufi orders in Yemen, specifically the Shadali dervishes, began brewing this dark liquid, which they called kawa, to endure their grueling, night-long dhikr ceremonies. Because on the path to reaching God, the greatest enemy was sleep, the weakness of the human body. Coffee was a spiritual elixir that conquered sleep and kept the mind violently open to the divine. Huddled together in dark, cavernous shrines, illuminated only by the flickering light of a frail oil lamp, the dervishes would sway for hours, passing small ceramic cups of the thick, bitter liquid from hand to hand. Coffee was not born as a casual luxury. It was born as a gateway, a threshold between the physical world and the spiritual realm. But this mystical dark water could not remain trapped behind the stone walls of monasteries forever. Very soon, it would spill out into the streets and detonate a revolution that would consume the entire world. Coffee was simply too powerful a secret to remain forever hidden behind the stone walls of Sufi monasteries. By the mid-1400s, the port city of Aden, clinging to the edge of the Red Sea, was one of the beating hearts of the medieval world. It was not merely a harbour, it was the great intersection of humanity. With the first light of dawn, Arab dhows with their sweeping sails glided into port, their wooden hulls groaning under the weight of the world's wealth. Silks from India, spices from the Far East, gold and ivory from the depths of Africa. The air hung thick, a heavy, suffocating blend of salty sea spray and the sharp, piercing aroma of cinnamon and cardamom. Merchants shouted across the docks in a dozen different languages. Porters hoisted massive burlap sacks onto their bruised shoulders. Long, sweeping camel caravans disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert horizon. And right here, in the absolute center of this chaotic, sprawling theater of trade, that dark, bitter elixir, once known only to the mystics, began to seep into the streets. Aden became the crucible where coffee shed its sacred ceremonial garments and surrendered itself to the common man. It was no longer consumed merely to reach out to God. It was brewed to conduct business, to endure the agonizing heat of the day, and simply to exist. The very first Coffeehouses, the ancestors of every cafe in the world, opened in these dusty, labyrinth-like streets of Yemen. What seems entirely mundane to us today was, at the time, an earth-shattering, revolutionary concept. Because before coffee, the idea of a secular public space simply did not exist. There was no place where men could gather purely for the sake of conversation. If you wished to pray, you went to the mosque. If you wished to trade, you went to the bazaar. But the Coffeehane was entirely unprecedented. It was history's first truly civic gathering ground. When you stepped through the low wooden door, it took a moment for your eyes to adjust to the heavy, smoke-filled twilight. Across the floor, men sat shoulder to shoulder on woven carpets and embroidered cushions. Within these walls, social hierarchy dissolved. A wealthy merchant, an exhausted dock worker, a wandering poet, and a rugged soldier all sat around the same glowing hearth, sipping the exact same dark liquid. No one asked who you were. Ideas, news, and stories simply flowed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth. People weren't just drinking coffee. For the very first time in the modern sense, they were socializing. And to the men who ruled them, this was the terrifying sound of a quiet revolution. Over the glowing crimson embers of oak wood, heavy copper pots, the traditional dallas, simmered for hours. As the thick, black liquid reached a rolling boil, a dense, golden layer of microfoam would gather at the surface. The master brewer would pour this scalding, bitter nectar into tiny ceramic cups with the precision of an alchemist. Because what was pouring out of that copper spout wasn't merely a beverage. It was absolute, undiluted awareness. When you took that first agonizingly bitter sip, a profound clarity washed over your mind within seconds. The heavy fog of fatigue vanished. Tongues loosened. Words poured from lips with a sudden, uncharacteristic bravery. The human mind, fueled by the dark water in that tiny cup, began to push past its own boundaries. But as minds opened, so did mouths. Poets began to recite satirical verses about their rulers. Merchants openly complained about crushing taxes. Ordinary men sat in the dimly lit corners, daring to question the authority of the state.
It is the dead of night. The governor, Khair Beg, prowls the silent, winding streets with his armed guards. The mosque courtyards are empty. The city is asleep. But as the governor rounds a narrow corner, he is met by a warm yellow light spilling from a doorway, accompanied by the loud, roaring sound of laughter, heated debate, and subversive poetry. It was a Kavehane. Khair Beg stood in the shadows and listened. Men were openly mocking the state's policies. They were reciting sharp, biting satire about the ruling elite. The sheer terror of seeing common people gathering in the dark, their minds sharpened by this black water, discussing the affairs of the state, sent a shiver down the governor's spine. Authority was panicking. The very next morning, Khair Beg summoned the greatest religious scholars, jurists, and physicians of Mecca. He posed a single, loaded question. Is this liquid intoxicating? Does it violate the laws of Islam? Everyone in the room knew the truth. Coffee didn't intoxicate, it did the exact opposite. It made you hyper-aware. But this wasn't a matter of theology, it was a matter of control. Gathering people was dangerous. And so, the verdict was delivered. The first recorded coffee ban in human history was declared in Mecca. Porcelain cups were smashed against the cobblestones. Sacks of raw coffee beans were dragged into the streets and set ablaze. Heavy wooden locks were hammered into the doors of the Kavahanes, and those caught drinking the dark liquid were publicly whipped in the town square. But Governor Khair Beg had forgotten one fundamental truth of human nature. Once the human mind is awakened, you cannot force it back to sleep. The ban was an utter failure. The people didn't abandon coffee, they simply drove it underground. It moved behind closed doors, into dark cellars and hidden backrooms. Coffee had been transformed from a simple drink into a powerful symbol of defiance and civil disobedience. 13 years later, when the mighty Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim conquered Egypt and the Hejaz, he heard of this absurd prohibition. The Sultan issued an immediate decree declaring that coffee was not intoxicating, and the ban was lifted. The coffeehouses threw open their doors, more magnificent and crowded than ever before. The genie was out of the bottle. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from every corner of the known world flocked to the grand courtyard of Mecca. From Africa, from Asia, from the distant reaches of Andalusia, they all walked the streets of Mecca and tasted this magical black water. And when it was time to return home, they carried back more than just the spiritual peace of their pilgrimage. Deep in their saddlebags, they smuggled roasted coffee beans. Caravans crossed the unforgiving deserts. Coffee reached Aleppo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. In Cairo, the students of the great Al-Azhar University consumed endless cups of coffee to study through the long, grueling nights. Scholars wrote entire manuscripts sitting at the tables of the Kavahanes. The Arab world had awakened, and now this black gold was preparing to cross the borders once again, marching toward the very heart of the greatest empire on earth, toward Istanbul. When the city of Constantinople fell in 1453, it wasn't just an empire changing hands. The very soul of the city was being reconstructed. Istanbul became the beating heart of the world, sitting squarely at the crossroads of every major global trade route. But the destiny of this magnificent city would be profoundly altered by something far smaller than an army. A century after the conquest, two ordinary merchants from Aleppo and Damascus, named Hakem and Shams, walked into the city. In 1554, they rented a tiny, unassuming shop in Tatakale, the bustling commercial district of Istanbul. Inside, a roaring fire crackled in the hearth, and colourful woven rugs adorned the stone walls. And soon, that heavy, roasted, mystical aroma began to seep into the narrow alleyways. At first, only the curious stepped inside. A month later, lines began to form at the door. Within 3 months, the city of Istanbul had completely surrendered to this black water. The obsession grew so fast that in less than a decade, hundreds of coffeehouses opened in every district of the city. Historical records suggest the number exceeded 600. To put that into perspective, the total number of social gathering places in London, Paris, and Rome combined at that time couldn't even compare. Through coffee, Istanbul had unwittingly constructed the world's first modern public sphere. Anyone looking to escape the suffocating rigidity of the palace, the solemnity of the mosque, or the exhausting chaos of the bazaar found sanctuary here. The moment you stepped over the threshold, your rank, your title, and your social class evaporated. On the exact same wooden bench, a fierce Janissary soldier sat next to a delicate poet. A powerful vizier rubbed shoulders with a weary dockworker. They sipped the same bitter liquid, breathing the same smoke-filled air. These spaces quickly evolved into schools of knowledge. Chess and backgammon boards clattered on wooden tables. In the corners, the shadows of the Karagoz puppet theatre danced on parchment screens. And on a slightly raised platform next to the hearth, the Medas, the great traditional storytellers, wove captivating tales. Men would sit for hours, fueled by the unique, electrifying wakefulness that coffee provided, listening to poetry and fiercely debating philosophy. Minds were opening wider than ever before. But open minds lead to open mouths. Soon, the conversations turned from philosophy to politics. Men began to criticize the state, question the Sultan's decrees, and murmur about rebellion. And it wasn't long before those murmurs slipped through the cracks of the coffeehouse walls and reached the ears of the Sultan. The true reign of terror began in 1633 under the rule of Sultan Murad IV, one of the most ruthless and terrifying monarchs in Ottoman history. A massive fire had just reduced much of Istanbul to ashes, and the whisper networks in the coffeehouses blamed the state's incompetence. The Sultan's response was apocalyptic. He ordered the immediate demolition of every single coffeehouse in the city. But he didn't stop at demolition. Murad IV began to patrol the dark, narrow streets of Istanbul at night, heavily disguised, gripping a massive, brutal broadsword. If he caught even the faintest scent of roasted coffee drifting from a hidden basement or a back alley shop, the punishment was absolute and immediate. Death. Men caught drinking coffee were sewn into leather sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. Coffee makers were beheaded on the spot. At night, the only sound echoing through the streets of Istanbul was the heavy, terrifying footsteps of the Sultan. Yet, Here lies the greatest paradox of history. Neither the bloody sword of Murad IV nor the brutal bans of the viziers that followed could destroy coffee, because the very palace that was executing people for drinking it had already become completely enslaved to the dark liquid. Behind the towering, impenetrable walls of the Topkapi Palace, coffee was no longer just a beverage. It had become a paramount pillar of state protocol. An entirely new, highly prestigious office was created, the Kahvetchi Basha, the chief coffee maker to the Sultan. He commanded a massive staff of hundreds and was one of the very few men permitted to enter the Sultan's private chambers. His loyalty was unquestioned, and his singular duty in life was to prepare the Sultan's coffee with absolute perfection. Gold-embroidered trays, diamond-encrusted porcelain cups, solid silver pots. The presentation of coffee became a magnificent weapon of diplomacy, showcasing the absolute wealth and power of the Ottoman Empire. When foreign ambassadors were granted an audience, offering them coffee was the ultimate symbol of peace and friendship. But if the Sultan deliberately withheld a cup of coffee from an envoy, it was a profound insult and often a quiet declaration of war. The intricate politics of a massive empire had been distilled into a tiny porcelain cup. And deep within the harem, the most mysterious and heavily guarded heart of the palace, coffee had been elevated into an exquisite art form. Young concubines brought from the far corners of the world underwent years of grueling education. Alongside literature, music, and etiquette, they spent years mastering the delicate art of coffee. The exact temperature of the water, the glowing heat of the embers, the flawless distribution of the golden foam into the cup, everything was executed in a silent, almost religious ritual. If a coffee presented to the Valida Sultan, the Queen Mother, lacked its signature foam, it was considered an unforgivable failure. Coffee also embedded itself deeply into Ottoman matrimonial traditions. During matchmaking ceremonies, a young woman's ability to brew the perfect cup of coffee was the ultimate test of her patience and grace. The tradition of serving heavily salted coffee to the groom, a custom still practiced in Turkey today, was born in these very corridors centuries ago. The Ottomans had taken a simple berry from an Ethiopian forest, roasted it, refined it, and given it a soul. And when this great empire eventually pushed its armies to the very gates of Europe, they would inadvertently leave this dark, powerful legacy behind. The year is 1683. Vienna, the glittering heart of the Holy Roman Empire, was witnessing one of the most terrifying spectacles in history. The Ottoman war machine, a seemingly invincible force of 140,000 men, had violently battered against the city's gates for 60 agonizing days. Europe held its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But at the final hour, the arrival of a massive allied European army turned the tide of the battle. The Ottoman forces were shattered, forced into a chaotic, rapid retreat. It was a monumental turning point that forever altered the geopolitical landscape of the world. But as the Ottomans fled, they left something behind in the muddy, blood-soaked fields of the battlefield. Hundreds of massive burlap sacks. When the victorious European soldiers cut them open, they found thousands of hard, green beans. Assuming it was merely camel feed, they prepared to dump the entire lot into the Danube River or burn it as firewood. However, among the soldiers was a Polish merchant named Franz Georg Kolschitsky. Having lived in Istanbul for years, he understood the Ottoman culture intimately. He knew exactly what magic lay dormant inside those strange green seeds. As his reward for his service in the war, he asked for nothing but those sacks. Kolschitsky roasted the beans, ground them down, and opened the very first coffee house in Vienna, the Blue Bottle. Initially, the Europeans recoiled at the harsh, bitter taste. To soften the blow, Kolschitsky began to filter the coffee and blend it with honey and milk. And from the ashes of one of history's most brutal sieges, the elegant, world-renowned Viennese coffee culture was born. Coffee may have entered the continent through the gates of Vienna, but its true intellectual explosion detonated on an island, Great Britain. Following the opening of the first coffee house in Oxford in 1650, the streets of London became absolutely spellbound by this dark water. Within just 20 years, more than 500 coffee houses had erupted across the city. They became known as the penny universities. For the price of a single penny, you bought a cup of coffee and the right to sit among the most brilliant minds of the century. Scientists, writers, politicians, and philosophers debated everything from the rotation of the planets to poetry and global maritime trade. The coffee houses became so profoundly influential that King Charles II, terrified that they were breeding grounds for treason against the crown, attempted to ban them. The public outcry was so ferocious that the king was forced to back down. But the greatest invention to emerge from the British coffee houses wasn't philosophy. It was finance. Modern capitalism was forged on the smoke-stained wooden tables of these very rooms. In a coffee house owned by a man named Edward Lloyd, ship captains and wealthy merchants would gather to pool their money, signing contracts to insure against the brutal risks of oceanic voyages. That single room evolved into Lloyd's of London, the largest insurance market on the planet. In another establishment called Jonathan's Coffee House, merchants began casually buying and selling shares of corporate stock. That small, chaotic room eventually transformed into the London Stock Exchange. The entire nervous system of the global economy had literally been built around a cup of coffee. But coffee's most destructive and explosive power would be unleashed in another European capital, Paris. By the late 18th century, France was writhing in poverty and fury. While absolute luxury reigned within the Palace of Versailles, starvation plagued the streets. And just as it happened in Istanbul and Mecca, the furious minds of the city began to gather in the coffee houses. These cafes became the headquarters of the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot drank endless cups of coffee as they systematically dismantled the divine right of kings with their words. On July 12, 1789, the tension finally snapped. At the Café de Foix in the gardens of the Palais Royal, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a café table. With 2 pistols in his hands, he screamed to the enraged, coffee-fueled crowd, "To arms! Do not let them slaughter us!" The spark ignited on that café table led directly to the storming of the Bastille 2 days later, bringing the French monarchy crashing to the ground. The French Revolution did not begin in the streets. It began in the center of a smoke-filled Parisian coffee house. It suddenly became incredibly clear why kings and sultans had spent centuries trying to ban this dark, subversive liquid. Yet, beyond the wars, the revolutions, and the stock exchanges, coffee had also gracefully woven itself into the very center of European art and daily pleasure. In Germany, the coffeehouses of Leipzig became the vibrant meeting grounds for musicians and intellectuals. The legendary composer Johann Sebastian Bach directed his own musical ensemble at Zimmermann's Coffeehouse. The obsession with coffee grew so intense that Bach actually composed history's first and only mini-opera dedicated entirely to the drink, the Coffee Cantata. In this humorous masterpiece, a young, coffee-addicted woman named Lieschen rebels against her strict father, who demands she give up the habit. She famously sings, "If I cannot drink my bowl of coffee 3 times a day, then in my torment I will shrivel up like a piece of roasted goat." Ah, how sweet coffee tastes, lovelier than 1,000 kisses, smoother than muscatel wine. The great philosopher Voltaire was rumoured to drink anywhere from 40 to 50 cups a day. When his physician warned him that the dark liquid was slowly poisoning him, Voltaire simply smiled and replied, "I think you are right, but it must be a very slow poison, for I have been drinking it for 84 years. This simple green seed, born in the misty forests of Ethiopia, boiled in the mystic shrines of Yemen, and transformed into a colossal culture in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, had now enlightened Europe, sparked revolutions, and built modern economies. But coffee's epic journey was far from over. Before it lay a massive ocean and an entirely new world waiting to be conquered. Coffee had enlightened Europe, fueled revolutions, and birthed a completely new culture. But the European climate was simply far too cold to cultivate this demanding plant on a massive scale. As consumption skyrocketed, the European empires desperately needed hot, tropical lands of their own to grow their new addiction. And so, their eyes turned across the ocean to the New World. In 1720, an ambitious French naval officer named Gabriel de Clear secretly clipped a tiny coffee seedling from the private royal greenhouse of King Louis XIV. He carefully placed it inside a small glass box and set sail across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean, bound for the Caribbean island of Martinique. But the voyage rapidly descended into a nightmare. The ship barely survived an attack by Tunisian pirates. Then they were battered by a terrifying hurricane. And worse still, when the winds died and the ship lay paralyzed in the middle of the ocean for weeks, the fresh water supply ran dry. As the crew withered away from dehydration, water was strictly rationed. In that brutal fight for survival, de Clear did something unimaginable. Every single day, he secretly shared half of his own meager water ration with the tiny, fragile green seedling inside the glass box. At the risk of his own life, he kept the plant alive. When the ship finally reached the shores of Martinique, the seedling had survived. De Clear planted it in the volcanic soil and built a fortress of thorn bushes to protect it. And that single, fragile tree performed a miracle. Within 50 years, that one seedling had multiplied into 18 million coffee trees. The tiny green clipping that crossed the ocean inside a glass box became the genetic ancestor of the entire massive coffee industry across Central and South America today. Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica. The rich volcanic soils of the Americas were an absolute paradise for coffee. Europe's insatiable hunger for the dark liquid would forever alter the face of a completely new continent. But this colossal industry would demand one of the darkest and most horrifying prices in human history. Coffee had liberated the minds of the Europeans, but that very same coffee violently stripped away the freedom of others. To plant, cultivate, and harvest millions of coffee cherries by hand under the scorching sun required a massive disposable workforce. To meet this demand, the European colonizers constructed one of history's greatest tragedies: the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved Africans were shackled in the dark, suffocating hulls of ships, transported across the ocean and forced to work on the brutal coffee plantations of South America and the Caribbean. In Brazil, the coffee economy was so violently profitable that the country would become the very last nation in the Western world to abolish slavery. Every single drop of that elegant, enlightening beverage consumed in the chic cafes of Vienna, the bright salons of London, and the revolutionary tables of Paris was paid for with blood, sweat, and unimaginable suffering across the ocean. Coffee, once again, had become the very ink with which history was written. Today, the ancient, bloody, and mystical days of the coffee bean have faded into the past. When we look at a global map today, that thick band hugging the equator just north and south is known as the Coffee Belt. Born in the misty, isolated mountains of Ethiopia, this plant is now cultivated in over 70 countries. It is the second most heavily traded commodity on the planet, trailing only behind oil. It is the lifeblood of millions of families, a colossal, unstoppable gear in the global economic machine. That liquid we hastily gulp down from a cardboard cup on our frantic morning commute, desperately seeking a jolt of energy, is actually the carrier of a 1,000-year-old legacy. Yet, how quietly and slowly it all began. The sacred water consumed by Sufi mystics to reach God in the dark shrines of Yemen has mutated into an energy drink in towering glass skyscrapers. The elegant porcelain cups of the Ottoman merchants playing chess in Tahtakale have been replaced by disposable paper cups with our names misspelled on them. But while the shape has changed, the essence remains completely untouched. It is still the same dark water that sharpens our minds, brings us together, and keeps the world spinning. A journey that began with the simple curiosity of an Ethiopian goat herder, destroyed empires, crossed oceans, and built entirely new worlds. And the greatest revolutions in human history will always continue to sleep at the bottom of that tiny, black cup. Join us on our next journey as we explore the story of the white crystal that dictated the bloodiest trade routes in history: salt. If you enjoyed this historical journey, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Until we meet again in the dark pages of history.